Andy, I'm always so happy to sit and talk with you, and to do that today with an audience is fantastic. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it is a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
So I've given our listeners a little glimpse into the work that you do by my introduction, but I would like to ask you to start with a little bit more. And I want to go all the way back to, at least for me, the beginning, which is to say your book, Culture Making. Obviously, that was not the beginning of your kind of intellectual journey into ideas, but I would say that that book, I still remember reading it, talking to people about it, making some changes in my life in response to it that have continued. It just has been really formative for me. And so I thought maybe we could introduce your work by going all the way back to the starting point and asking you to talk a little bit about that book, and take it wherever you want. But I was thinking about just the questions of like, what is culture? What is culture making? Like, why does this
Yeah.
matter? And I think it still matters a lot. So I wanted to start there.
Wow, wow. Well, I'm happy to. That book began as an idea in about 2004 and was published in 2008. It took a while to get the idea to turn into a book. And the idea came from really a decade, it was like a 15-year history behind that idea, which was my dawning conviction that especially my fellow Christians lacked a vocabulary for what we were doing in the world. That
Mm,
is, we had vocabulary for evangelism and for mission narrowly. Though I think often it's good to understand mission narrowly, crossing boundaries for the sake of the love of God and the love of other people. Um, we had categories for discipleship, many things that we, I think, have thought through relatively well, but we had not hooked them up to what most people spend most of their days doing,
mm,
which is actually culture. I mean, most jobs are making or sustaining some aspect of human culture, not evangelism, not discipleship per se,
hmm
not mission narrowly understood. And I had spent 10 years working with college students, and college and education generally is preparation for cultural contribution. And
Yeah.
in a way, if I lacked a vocabulary for that, I lacked a vocabulary to equip them for the main thing that they were
Mm,
actually doing with their days in the library, in the lab, on the
right.
field, so it took me 15 years, but the book Culture Making basically starts with a definition of culture that I didn't make up, but that I can remember. Unlike many definitions of culture, which sociologists provide that I didn't make up either, but I can't remember them because they're long and they have multiple syllable words. Ken Myers is this wonderful journalist. Had a definition I could actually remember that I actually think
Mm,
captures it, and that is culture is what we make of the world in both senses. Culture is the actual material that human beings make. It
mm,
always is material, actually. And it's the meaning we make. It's always full of meaning. There's actually no material thing, pretty much, that human beings make that isn't laden with meaning.
mm.
And there's no meaningful activity human beings engage in that doesn't end up with some material component or effect in the world. Even this podcast, it's mostly meaning, right? Because it's mostly conversation, language, and we sort of think of that as pure meaning, but in fact, we're doing it through speech. We're doing it through
Yeah.
sound. We are encoding the motion of material airwaves back and forth. And you and I, as we speak, and then our listeners, as they listen, are actually engaged in a physical activity, not just a meaning activity. So,
Mm,
yeah. And then the other big idea. So I just kind of opened up Ken's amazing, fruitful definition, and then just made the case this is actually something Christians should always have cared about. We have cared about it in kind of the wrong ways. We've been very good at complaining about culture. We've actually been very good at consuming culture and being conformed to culture by consuming
mm,
it. But we haven't been very good at cultivating it and creating it. And
mm,
cultivating meaning taking care of what's already there, and creating meaning adding something significant to the world with our
mm.
lives, our collective lives. So that was the idea. Does that match what you took away?
Yes, and it's so interesting because I didn't remember that I assume this is in the book, the Ken Myers definition. And I will just
Yeah.
say for listeners, we'll add a link to the show notes to Ken Myers. He has his own kind of app called the Mars Hill Audio Journal that Peter, my
the
husband and
best
I,
podcast in the world before there were
yeah,
podcasts.
exactly. We used to get the tapes. So
Yes, yes,
that's
cassette tapes.
probably one of the reasons why your book resonated so much for me is that I was already kind of tracking with Ken Myers. But um, I think that for me, the idea of, first of all, having a positive contribution to make, that idea of both cultivating and creating.
Yes,
And secondly, I mean, I remember you talking about like making an omelet is a
yes,
cultural act, right?
yes,
Like
yes,
that sense of the
yes.
materiality, but also the materiality of this podcast or this realm of ideas, which is where I tend to swim. But it just gave
Yeah.
me a much broader view of, again, what it means to engage um, constructively, positively,
Mm,
with hope and purpose in the world.
mm,
And that was incredibly encouraging to me. I think as just at that point, a young writer, for me, my first book, which was not traditionally published, also came out in 2008, which we talked about long, long ago. And so,
yeah.
yeah, as someone who is trying to bring things into the world that might, form and shape people through stories, it was really, really helpful. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which has to do with language and culture.
Mm,
And I will back up a minute because I've thought a lot. I think because, I was an English major, I write books. Of course, I think about the ways language shapes culture, the ways culture shapes language. Recently, I have come back to thinking again about specific words. And
mm,
as most listeners of this podcast know, I have a daughter with Down syndrome. And a couple
mm,
months ago, someone sent me an essay in Rolling Stone about the rise of what we tend to call the R word, a slur that is used to refer to
mm.
people with intellectual disabilities. And then more recently, someone sent me a study that showed that Elon Musk had used that word on X, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
there was an exponential rise in other people also using that word on X, which was just this kind of dramatic visual of one person in a position of cultural power shaping the way other people respond.
Wow.
And so I've just been wanting to think with you, like talk with you a little bit about that
Mm,
relationship between language and culture, how, again, how language shapes culture, but also how culture can kind of shape language, like how those things are
mm,
related to each other,
mm.
and what it might look like to be on the creation side of that, on the kind of not being the
Yes.
word police, but also like
Yeah.
bringing something that is like good and true and beautiful into the world when it comes to language. I think, yeah, I guess I don't want to be someone who says you're not allowed to use those words because they're
Huh,
bad.
huh,
But I also want to
yeah.
say, here's what happens when we speak in this way or in this way. And I want to be speaking in a way that brings, yeah,
Yes.
shapes culture in a positive way. So I just wanted to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Wow. Wow. Well, a bunch of things come to mind. The first is actually a quote that I won't probably reproduce perfectly because I'm going by memory. That would seem to have very little to do with this because it's about a super material reality, which is eating.
Hmm.
But from Wendell Berry, who is this obviously amazing, important writer and kind of prophetic figure of our time. And there's a line in an essay I believe called "The Gift of Good Land" where he says, "In order to live in the world, we must break its body and eat it.
Hmm.
Break its body and drink its blood.
Hmm.
And we can either do that carelessly, heedlessly, thoughtlessly, and it's a sacrilege, or we
Hmm.
can do it thoughtfully, carefully, reverently, and it's a sacrament."
Wow.
And that idea that there's in a sense there's damage involved by living. I mean, we eat plants, many of us eat animals, and we disrupt the world in living in it, but we either do that without care or we do it with care, and that makes all
Hmm.
the difference. And that's what comes to mind when I think about um, maybe the deepest level of how language shapes culture is not what is denoted or connoted. It's is there care behind it.
Hmm.
And by care I mean both kindness but
Hmm.
also attention.
Yeah.
And and all of us have you, without exception, have used language carelessly, thoughtlessly, heedlessly, in ways that have done further damage in an already damaged world. And and part of the reason that you're probably right to not want to end up just policing language is for one thing what we see, and we see this specifically with these slurs, we call them, which are, by the way, the last taboo, because people use profanity in public all the time and no one cares. But
Hmm.
there are a small number of words which all of us have heard, and many of us at some point in our lives have said, that we
Hmm.
now don't even repeat, except in very specific cultural contexts. And there's this idea that if we just stamp out that word, we'll stamp out the damage. But in fact, what we see consistently is you have to keep
Yes.
shifting the target of which word is the damaging word. And and then interestingly, some of them kind of lose their power. In other words, I don't think anyone will be unduly offended by my referring to the word Negro. We use it in public still, like the United Negro College Fund and so forth,
Mm.
even though it's adjacent to another word that we rightly don't use. But the history of that word is super interesting because it becomes a slur, and then the black community actually claims the word black in the late 1960s and says, no, don't call us that other word. Now call us this. Well, then black becomes freighted with emotion and
Yeah.
the deprival of dignity. And so then people say, initially it's Afro-American and then African-American. So we keep moving the language to try to stay ahead of the co-opting of that to deny people of dignity, but you just have to keep changing the word. The damage is done not with an utterance, but with a carelessness. I don't even think it's intent always. And that's where Elon Musk's
Right.
example is interesting. He's not setting out to damage, but he's perpetuating damage by using that language. So that's the first thought is, gosh, carefulness matters. And then I think the really hard thing is that it's so much easier to damage things than to repair them. And
Mm.
and it's so
Yeah.
much easier to create an environment of coarseness and destructiveness than it is to build beauty in the midst of that.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yes.
I, there's this kind of famous story of this cellist whose name escapes me
Hmm.
now, who went to play during the war when bombs were being dropped on Sarajevo, and would play outside amidst the ruins of that
Yeah.
beautiful, formerly beautiful city that had been completely devastated by war. And it's both a very moving and kind of inspiring story, and it's also like so unsatisfying because, like, what can one little cello player do in a
Right.
crater? And when people are being careless around you, and damage is being perpetuated. And by the way, this is linked to profanity, and interestingly, the one way it's shown up is people on the political left in America have begun swearing in public very consistently. So
Hmm.
it started in 2016 when Donald Trump was
Hmm.
elected. The political left was so agitated at a significant uh, diminution of our public life, I would say, that they suddenly felt free to do something politicians had never done in American history, which is use the not the slurs, but the just the basically the coarse ways of referring to the fact that we have bodies.
Hmm.
Our bodies engage in sort of complex, uncomfortable, and in some ways wasteful
Hmm.
activities, right? Excretion and as well as the potentially more fruitful generation of life. And all the profanities circle around this fact that we have bodies, but refer to it in a very coarse way, whether it's the act of sexual generation or the act of excretion or whatever, right? And politicians have never felt free in public to use those words.
Yeah.
And now it's all over public political discourse from the left because the feeling was it's sort of necessary to respond to a different kind of coarseness. It's interesting. Donald Trump, to my knowledge, never uses profanity in public.
Hmm.
but he does use language damagingly in public.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other side is like, all right, we're going to double down on that
Huh.
and use that language too. And it's very understandable when you see language being corrupted and used to damage and used to convey contempt, both in what's said and what's in the emotion with which it's said. You're very tempted to think we got to play the same game. And I think the courage to not play that game and
Yeah.
continue to use words carefully when everyone else is using them damagingly, I mean, that requires a level of faith. Uh, I think ultimately in God and the goodness and righteousness of God that is very hard to muster because you really
Yeah.
feel like the cellist in the bomb crater.
Yeah, there's so much I would like to say in response, but what I will say is this. I'm struck by just even in the history of what I'm calling the R word. I've done some of the looking at it, and you're exactly right. It was actually introduced in order to get rid of the slur
Yeah.
idiot, which now we
Yes.
use without
Yes.
any sense of
Yes.
that
Isn't that
being a
interesting?
slur, right? So
Right.
it was meant to actually be an uplifting thing to say, no, we're
Yeah.
diagnosing this child with mental
Right.
retardation
Right.
that, got short.
Right.
Now people might make, if they aren't going to use that word, they might say, well, I see jokes about the short bus, which is often a bus that kids who
Oh,
have,
for
and
special needs or whatever. Yeah.
yes, exactly, or
Huh.
take to school.
Wow.
So there are
Wow.
other ways to do
Huh.
it. I mean, it's just, and that's to your point that like, what we're actually concerned about, I mean, it is the language because it represents this sense of a damaging
Mm-hmm.
attitude or a careless one, either way, towards a group of people. But there's also a sense in which the language is not the problem. And that's where I also think that one of the things that I have been so grateful for over the course of my experience, especially as the mother of a daughter with an intellectual disability, is my friends who've said, hey, I used this word and I'm really sorry.
Hmm.
And I have, sure, I wish they hadn't used the word, but I care much more about that sense of I'm taking care with my language in this interpersonal way. And I think we need to make space for people to, if we're in a posture of some words are good and some are bad, and you can use them or not, and you are good or bad if you use them or not, we can also
Mm-hmm.
get into this place of not being able to actually forgive and
Mm.
to have the relational repair that can happen even in those spaces. So that's just some of what you were talking about
Yeah.
got me thinking about that
Mm.
perfection in language is not what we're looking
Mm.
for, but there is, I think, to your point, just a degree of carefulness um, that it comes out of care, not out of a desire to get it all right, but comes out of like
Yes.
actual, as I think I wrote down, kindness and attention as your description
Yes.
of what it might mean to care. And I think here's my other question though. So this is related, I think, to what we're talking about when it comes to power, because I'm also curious about the ways in which um, status and power and language plays into a desire for status and for an exertion of power. And again, for listeners who have not read all your books, as I have, there are a couple that are related to this topic. One called Strong and Weak, which is actually an easier read, I would say, than the other one I'm going to mention,
Sure.
which is
Sure.
called Playing God. They're both
Yeah.
very good, but Strong and Weak is short. It's like pocket sized and has a
Yeah.
lot of,
Yeah.
uh, what are they called? 2x2 grids that are
Yes.
incredibly helpful about
Yeah.
vulnerability and power. And in both cases, I just think about the ways we create human hierarchies based on status
Mm.
and the ways
Yes.
I increasingly, when I read Jesus's words and actions in the Gospels, he seems to want to both interrupt and dismantle status hierarchies.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to kind of add power and status to this
I love it.
conversation in terms of
Yeah.
like where that desire comes from and why that desire. I think that, I guess here's what I'm getting at. The desire, I think, for high status is a part of our when we are in that posture, I think that's part of when we do damage and
Mm.
are not careful with other people. I hadn't thought of
Wow.
that until you got me going
Wow.
there, but that's what I'm wondering about.
Yes. 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 I think status is the very heart of the matter when it comes to thinking, especially as Christians, about power, because I don't think it's correct to say that Jesus had no power or gave up power. There's all kinds of indications in the Gospels, and people around him experienced him as a person of great power, though
Hmm.
not power just like, say, Augustus Caesar's power, a different kind of power, but certainly he had power. And
Yeah.
what he did give up, and I think this is both, we see it in his own life, and then we see it in the early Christian reflection on it, as in Philippians 2, which is this probably hymn that predates Paul, where Paul talks about, though he had equality with God, he didn't count it as something to be grasped, but emptied himself.
Yeah.
And what did he not grasp, and what did he empty himself? Not actually the power of being, as we Christians believe, the second person of the Trinity. He never stopped being that. He never stopped having access to the true power that comes through full communion with the Father in the bond of love of the Spirit. But what he did give up was equality, that is rank. And status is
Mm.
ranked power. Status
Yes.
always
Mm.
is connected with what's your place in line uh, compared to another
Yes.
person, or place on the pyramid, or however you want to visualize it.
Hmm.
And that's what Jesus does not care about at all. And as you say, sometimes deliberately disrupts. So when
Yeah.
you sit down at a meal in the first century in Judea, and you've been walking on a dusty road, everybody's feet are dirty, and it's considered, for various cultural reasons, in a way that probably we don't much relate to now, kind of inappropriate to sit there with dirty feet and have a meal. So partly because you're all lying there and your feet are next to your neighbors. It's not like they're under the table, they're next to your neighbor, right? Um, so so usually there's a servant. If there's a servant, the servant comes around and washes people's feet before the meal.
Yeah.
But in some places, there's not a servant, and everyone, and this would have been all men generally. There's other stories actually about Jesus where that gets complicated too in a beautiful way. But just take the typical situation: you got a bunch of guys, they're sitting down for a
Yeah.
meal, and and everyone does this calculation: who is the lowest status person in the room? And that person, probably, definitely without being asked, generally without thinking, just knows, oh, I should pick up the basin and do this.
Mm.
And this we all know how this works. We've all been in settings where you kind of know whose job it is to go to the kitchen to refill the chips, and in principle anyone could do it, but in fact it's always somebody, right? And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a low status thing to refill the chips, but there's someone who, without thinking about it, knows this is my role in the situation, right? And that's cultural too. Like in white Western middle class American culture, that would usually be the mom of the house if it's a family. But in many other cultures that you and I could go visit, it's the youngest person, just usually the youngest child who's old enough to carry a bowl of chips. Well, no, it's my
Hmm.
job to go back to the kitchen, because
Yeah.
the younger serve the older, and it's not the woman of the house's job. Anyway, the disciples all are trying to, of course, they're in this complicated thing where they all don't really want to admit they're like the lowest, right? So there's this sort of moment of uncertainty: who's going to pick up the bowl? And Jesus, who is clearly the highest status person, picks up the bowl and the towel,
Yeah.
and then of course teaches on it and says, and it's interesting, he doesn't say anything about giving up power. He says, in fact, he says, I'm your Lord, I'm your master. A servant isn't, if I'm your master, do what you see the master doing. Like, he doesn't give up the role of master even.
Right.
He just says, status doesn't matter, and in fact we're going to turn it upside down. um so I here's the second thing I would add: these things get most perilous when there's status, when there's unclarity about status, or when there's competition for status, or when people are insecure about their status.
Mm.
And I think what's going on when people use damaging language to assert dominance, um, something we can see figures in public life all over the spectrum doing with rampant abandon in our time,
Yeah.
but also something all of us have done, whether we used bad words or not. In some moment when we felt insecure, you use it to try to diminish the other person, to diminish their dignity, diminish their standing as someone who has something to say to the community or something to offer, and thereby move up a few points in line. And when Elon Musk uses that word, it's absolutely what he's reflexively doing. He's not referring, as you point out in your wonderful essay on it, he's not referring to an actual person who would be diagnosed with mental retardation.
Right.
He's referring to an opponent in a debate in such a way as to rule that person out entirely as having
Yeah.
anything to contribute, and
Right.
thereby to elevate himself as someone who's manifestly more intelligent than this idiot,
Yes.
which we now feel free to say.
Yes. Right.
But probably we shouldn't say. But I mean, I'm not getting back into the policing thing, but like if we're being careful,
Yep.
I should not find myself in public even using that word, let alone the
Yep.
latest slur that has the most emotional power punch behind it.
Yep.
So what Elon Musk is doing is trying to establish dominance because he feels insecure. Now, there are societies and our own society with a lot of pathologies associated with this, but also some beneficial things. Once had a much clearer status hierarchy. It was known who was the prominent person in a given town or city, and it was often a family, and it was often multi-generational. That family was just kind of at the top of the status hierarchy. And there was this idea of condescension, which is an interesting word because it's changed meanings pretty significantly for us. It now means to be kind of patronizing or almost belittling, like you don't want someone to condescend. But there was a time in the 19th century in American English, when condescension was a virtue of those who know they have high status, but they actually treat other people with more dignity than they would have to, and they don't assert their own status as much as they could get away with. It's like, I mean, a simple example you'll still run into is you meet someone a little older or more senior than you, and you want to call them Mr. So-and-so or Dr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. And she says, "Oh, don't call me Dr. Becker, call me Amy Julia." And,
Yeah.
she has the right to be called Dr. So-and-so, but it's condescending in the best sense of saying,
Right.
actually, the word literally means to move down to be with, right? To condescend is to move down to be with. I'm going to be with you on a first name basis. In many European languages, when the person says, "Call me tu instead of vous," it's just
Yeah.
this, let's treat one another, even though we know the status is there. People only do that when they're secure.
Yeah.
When you're insecure is where you assert dominance and try to
Yep.
establish and we are living in a time of incredible insecurity where people just don't feel like they have enough power. And so you got to like trot out the diminishing, degrading rhetoric to establish that you and people like you count.
Thank you for all of that. I want to add one more factor to
Yeah,
this
yeah.
conversation, which is the fact that the role that technology plays. And let's
Mm,
be clear that
wow.
technology played a role in spreading language from the advent of the telegram with,
Back to
newspapers. Like it's
writing, I would say.
right. Like, yeah, go all the way
Yeah,
back. We can go back thousands of years. And
yep,
yet, X as a platform means
yeah,
that language is spread immediately. I think Elon Musk himself tweets, I mean, hundreds of times a day. So you're getting
yep.
these very short blasts that are going out to millions of people instantaneously. And so it brings in just, again, this idea that you've written a lot about. So I'll just mention again for listeners, there's a great book called The Tech Wise Family, which every person in our family has been required to read.
We won't
um,
say they all read it with total joy and freedom,
exactly.
but
Um, so
if they
I do
wanted a cell
recommend,
phone.
yes, I do recommend it for every listener out there trying to figure out the role of technology in the household. But I am also recently, and maybe this was in the book, I don't think so, but recently I've been reading you and hearing you write about the magic inherent
Mm,
within the current devices we have, which is not to say
mm.
that. Anyway, I want you to start just by explaining what you mean by magic, and then we can kind of loop
Okay.
technology
Wow.
and
Okay.
specifically what, our screens and phones into this conversation.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Well, I have to digress on something. You can cut this if you want. But I think it is super interesting that Elon Musk has had this lifelong fascination with the letter X. He bought the
Hmm.
X.com domain name like when he was running PayPal. He wanted to call PayPal X, but for various reasons it wasn't called that. So
Huh.
then he buys Twitter, right? Twitter is a word. The word Twitter is a word
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
birds do and so forth. It carries meaning. X is a symbol that stands for whatever meaning you want and doesn't
Huh.
actually say very much at all by itself, although it can kind of indicate annihilation, like to X out, right? And
Wow.
when Elon Musk gets hold of it, he replaces a meaning bearing name with a meaningless name or
Yeah.
a much less much less meaning laden. And it's interesting, he's the father of 12 children by at least 4 mothers.
Right.
When you look at the names of some of those kids, they are also kind of nihilistic,
Yes.
linguistically
Yes.
nihilistic. He chooses symbols which he then
Right.
has to redo because the state actually won't allow you to put that on a birth certificate, it turns out. But there is something very odd going on in this person who
Yeah.
wants to actually get away from the
Meaning
kind of
making.
the texture of language, and who's
Huh.
attracted to the symbolic that is kind of untethered from history. In other words, yeah, it was called Twitter when it was founded, but we're redoing it now, like, so untethered from history. Anyway, I just think there's something going on there, frankly.
Yeah.
And all right, so I do think this is absolutely connected to magic, actually. I've not thought about this before you kind of put these things together. So, my belief is that what we're trying to do with technology is magic. So, magic is the idea of having arbitrary, effortless, instant power over the world. Effortless is like you don't have to do much to get the power. You don't have to exert yourself. If I can magically move a rock, it means I don't have to lift the rock with my muscles, right? Instant means I don't have to be patient. I don't have to wait. The
Mm-hmm.
results are
Mm-hmm.
instantaneous or nearly
Yeah.
so. I just say the word and it happens. And then arbitrary, it is
Mm.
purely about my will. There's no inherent constraint on my will. Um, there's nothing holding me back. It's whatever I want, and I want it because I want it, and magic will let me get it.
Mm-hmm.
Also often arbitrary, and this is where the language connection comes in. A lot of times it's been thought that the way you get to do magic is through language, through spells. And
Mm.
these are words that don't have kind of they're not embedded in culture. They're like secrets that the universe discloses to you, that if you say this apparently arbitrary sequence of sounds like
Mm.
abracadabra, which is kind of our memory of this, that doesn't mean anything except it means something to the universe. And you, the magician, have found out the secret meaning. And when you
Mm.
say it, uh, it happens. Um, Now, this word abracadabra traces itself back to the magical writings of the mid second millennium. That is roughly, say, 1300 to 1600, maybe 1700. In the middle of the second millennium of the Christian era, European men, I think universally men, there is a history of magic among women, but it's a different thing from what I'm describing, start this quest to control the world through magic,
Mm.
and we
Mm.
call it alchemy. And they
Right.
borrow a bunch of ideas from the Arab, the Muslim world, including alchemia, the word, and they look for this substance called the philosopher's stone that will turn anything into gold and will give its possessor immortality. They look for the spells or the ways of accessing kind of the secret power, and they're also, by the way, trying to create slaves, the homunculus, the little human being
Mm.
who I will make, and will be able to control. Um,
Wow.
and I actually think so. When we think about the alchemists, which in one way we don't think about them very often at all, in another way we think about them all the time, because actually a bunch of these ideas still circulate. Mark Andreessen, who's a very powerful venture capitalist,
Yeah.
published this thing called the Techno Optimist Manifesto. And
Mm-hmm.
he said at one point in it, AI is our alchemy. We are teaching sand to think. That's, I think, a pretty direct quote from this essay. AI,
Okay.
artificial intelligence, is our new alchemy. In other words, this dream of alchemy,
Yeah.
though we mostly think of it as, hey, that didn't work out. There is no philosopher's stone. You can't just get eternal life, that way. You can't actually, it seems harder to make people than they thought, though we're working on it. it went away as science, but it absolutely stuck around as a dream.
Yeah.
And I think it's when we actually did discover how the natural world worked, because the alchemists in the end had very mistaken ideas about the natural world.
Hmm.
And so it was kind of a scientific dead end, but we figured stuff out in the 18th and 19th centuries. And when we set about implementing that, like operationalizing that in the world, what we set out to do was to do magic in almost all of the features I've talked about. So there's a group of Silicon Valley people who are absolutely obsessed with immortal life, with the infinite extension of human life. Some of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley are like pouring hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into the quest for that.
Yeah.
Um, Turning everything into gold. That is exactly what technology does. And by that, I mean, it takes everything that used to be non-economic and tries to make it economic.
Mm.
So your friends, I hope you still have friends, everyone who's listening, but Facebook, or now Meta, oh, by the way,
Yeah.
another change from an actual like embodied thing. The Facebook was this thing at Harvard College where every
Right.
first year had a picture taken and you knew who your fellow students were, right? It was faces. Facebook used to show you the faces of your friends. Why it was so powerful is you saw the faces often of people that you maybe went to school with who you hadn't seen in 10 years. That gets replaced by a word that means nothing except the next level up, which is meta, or
Right.
the next level behind. It doesn't mean anything. Oh my gosh, why is this? Actually, this happened to Google too. It turns into alphabet. Like
Right.
they're all saying, we want to get away from our history. We want to get away from embodiment and the story of how we
Hmm.
got here. And we're going to a level of abstraction because we aim to control everything. And in controlling everything, to turn it all into financialized money economy. So your friends, this is where I was originally going, your friends become a
Right.
commodity that
Right.
Facebook sells back to you at the price of your attention to the ads and now to the algorithm. Um, and it takes this thing that was completely non-economic. You never thought of your friends as having any economic value per se. And now they still don't have that much value to you, but in the aggregate to Facebook, that social graph is of tremendous economic value, right? Because it leverages attention and emotion. Um, anyway, sorry. If anybody's
No.
still with us, this is the dream behind technology. It's to do magic, and it's in the hands of magicians who fancy themselves as the people who are going to figure all this out, and it's going to
Right.
unlock incredible abundance above all for them. But it's a complete. I think it's always been a total dead end. I think magic is not the way the world is meant to work. It can work for a little while because it's deceptive in that way, but in the long run, it doesn't work, and it has very, very diminishing returns. Let's put it that way.
Well, I want to talk about that on two fronts. So the first is the relationship between the magic of phones and our particular technological age and the most vulnerable people among us. And the way
Mm,
I've been thinking about this is that our daughter Penny is my most socially and physically vulnerable child. That's just
mm,
true about
mm-hmm,
someone who has an intellectual disability and who has, low muscle tone and all these other kind of physical
mm,
components of the way her body has been constituted. She is also the of my three kids, the one who is the most likely to become addicted to things on her phone,
oh, yeah,
the
oh
most
yeah,
likely to
yeah,
be the victim of a scheme to
yeah,
send money or photos that she shouldn't send.
yeah.
She is the most likely to be cut off from the real human connection and personal formation she might otherwise experience as a result of being just sucked back into this device that, in some ways, feels like it protects her from these really vulnerable social interactions, but it actually keeps her
Wow,
from them. So I've just
wow,
been thinking about the
wow.
role, on the one hand, um, of the magic of the phone is really alluring to her because of, I think, that sense of like, finally, there's some place where I have some yeah, effortless and instantaneous um, power. And yet,
Yes,
on the flip
yes,
side of that, I think it makes her more vulnerable
yeah.
in multiple different ways. And so I've been thinking about like the ways that all of this is, and you've already spoken to this a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of like hone in on it a little bit, but the ways in which it's exploitative. And I think
Yeah.
that's probably true about many of us, but especially the most vulnerable.
Wow, wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually initially, when you kind of laid out this topic, I was actually initially thinking about the ways that this layer of magic is actually inaccessible to people with profound or even not,
Mm,
so, I mean, not uncommon disabilities. My mother is 85 with some cognitive issues,
yeah,
dementia, though very capable in many ways. She's not at the stage where she can't carry on a conversation or doesn't. She remembers
yeah,
lots of things, but one thing she cannot do is learn these interfaces of these digital devices.
yeah,
And this is very common among people who are older, who might have well been able to learn them at 65, but at 85 can't. And now she's cut off from all these things. And I mean, even as simple like, how do you get something that you need in the mail? You have to do that through this really complicated digital interface.
yeah,
And so there's that like directionality where it's hard for them to access it, but then there's also this way that people who have profound needs, and this is different from Penny's situation, so we'll come back to that. It also that they need a kind of attention that the digitally conformed don't know how to give.
mm-hmm,
So we who need to care for those with these particular
yeah,
kinds of needs have lost the ability to care, to pay attention and be kind in a way, insofar as we have gotten very dependent on this scaffold of a
mm-hmm,
digital. And uh, and of course, the great gift of people with certain kinds of disabilities is they kind of force us to exit
yeah,
that world of magic and be back in a world where there is no magic to be done, but there's an awful lot to learn about presence.
right,
I think I really appreciate though this other point, which is the way that, in a way, all of us are um, all of us have weakness, including psychological weakness, including the the fact that our bodies really like to not move and do hard things, and our bodies and brains actually. Whenever you ask your brain to do something really hard, it's like, can't we do something easier? And the digital world so wonderfully responds to my body's desire to be inactive.
yeah,
Because I think if you think about it evolutionarily, for most of human history, you had to be active all the time just to acquire enough calories to get through the next day, right? You had to be out harvesting or whatever.
right,
And so any chance you got when you had a surplus of calories to rest, your body was like, please, let's do that. But now
yeah,
we have a surplus of calories all the time, and our bodies are like, I'd like to rest all the time. And the digital world is there for you,
yeah,
to answer your body's call to be inactive, to be at rest, to be at leisure. And then your brain, same way. Your brain used to have to exert itself in various ways. And then we all know the true satisfaction of doing something really worthwhile with our minds. But your brain, I mean, so for me, I'm a musician, and practicing the piano is this. Practicing the piano, my brain hates doing it because it requires it to learn, and it's repetitive and very focused. It requires really careful attention to
yeah.
very, very small things if you really want to get better. And your brain is like screaming for the exit. It's like, can't we just
Stop.
play? Can't we just play this piece? Why do we have to work on it? Well, the digital absolutely taps into that. And
Mm-hmm.
when, as you are witnessing with your daughter, when the kind of systems to regulate that and push back on that thing that all of us have, isn't as strong, just like, in a way, like low muscle tone, there's also there are different degrees of being able to get to a point where you just resist the
Right.
invitation of the addictive.
Yeah,
uh, it's actually, I mean, a lot of very typically abled people are completely drawn in by this stuff, and as
for
am
sure.
I, right?
Yeah.
It's just that we may have a few layers of being able to kind of re-regulate
Mm-hmm.
that your daughter may not have. So, but they're playing on all the same weaknesses that all of us share.
Right.
It's by virtue of being human in a way.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and I do feel like Penny more often than not is a magnifying glass as opposed to some other
Yes,
other
yes,
situation. And
yes.
I think the other thing I wanted to bring up in this conversation about magic is the idea of control. So going back, I wrote
Yes.
an essay. right around Christmas time this year about the distinction between magic and mystery. So just to flesh that
Mm-hmm.
out a little bit, I was talking about how the magic of Christmas, that word is used a lot in December to refer to the stockings and the glittering lights and the, Santa Claus and all these things
Yeah,
that are
yeah.
under adult control. Like we actually can
Oh,
make this happen. But the mystery
whoa.
of
It's like
Christmas, I
Disney
believe,
World, the magic of
Disney
Disney
World.
World. Like
Yes,
the
exactly.
Imagineers are
Yes,
engineering every bit of magic. None of it's going to happen unless the Imagineers keep the machinery going. Wow. And Christmas
exactly.
is like, oh my gosh,
But
that's great.
then there's a mystery of Christmas, which is a story of a
Wow.
baby who is also God. And that's beyond our ability to comprehend, to control. It is actually, what I was really thinking about this year was the fact that in that mystery, like the birth of God into the world is actually able to hold both suffering and wonder. But like, there's no place
Wow.
for suffering in the magic
And
of Christmas.
yes,
There's no place
yes,
for all the people in December who are like, life is not
yes,
okay. Like
yes.
whereas in the mystery, I think that can still be very much held on to. And
Mm,
so I've just been thinking again about that
mm,
relationship between
mm,
a desire to avoid suffering and to control life, and magic as a means
mm.
to those ends that ultimately does not work at all, but
Right.
that deceives us into thinking it might.
Wow. Yes, yes, totally, totally. Well, and you said, the real Christmas, we might say, can hold together suffering and wonder. And I would actually say it is of the essence of the mystery that it includes suffering, that it includes limitation. And, Simeon, when he meets the baby Jesus, says to Mary, a
Yeah.
sword will pierce your soul, right? Like, this is a little 8-day old baby. And he's like,
Yeah.
and a sword is going to pierce your soul too.
Yeah.
Um,
And Herod's going to come wipe out the other infants
yes,
in
yes,
town as a
yes.
result of this
Wow.
birth. I mean, it's just horrible.
And so here's another interesting just riff on that. There's this odd thing that John says right around the very, very famous John 3:16 in that same conversation. If I'm not misremembering this with Nicodemus, Jesus says, "Oh no, no, no! Maybe it's in the prologue. Sorry, John. I think it's in John 1 where John talks about those who were born, and by this he means reborn in the way that Jesus talks about with Nicodemus, the those who are born not by the flesh, and maybe he says another term by blood, but then he has this weird thing. It is very gendered in Greek, nor by the will of a man. That is, those who were
Yeah.
born not by the will of a man, but by God, basically by the gift
Yeah.
of God. Now, the interesting thing about John is he said nothing about the virgin birth in
Right.
his own gospel. John over and over says nothing about things he clearly knows a lot about, like he never talks about the Lord's Supper, except he clearly is thinking about it all the time. There's all these things.
Yeah.
And I think this is another example where he knows that Jesus was born without the will of a man, without a
Yeah.
man deciding it's time to conceive a child and kind of taking the initiative, you might say, to put it
Yeah.
perhaps not as strongly as sometimes happens when men decide, they want that. Um, and John is saying this happened not through this kind of exertion of intention by a human being or desire for control. It happens instead through this young woman. We probably would look at her and think of her as a girl, but young woman in her
Yeah.
time who says, "Let it be to me according to your word," to the angel. She's not controlling it. She's not making it happen. No one's making it happen. Um, I'm not even sure it's right to. I'm not sure it's the right category of language to say God is making it. I'm not sure God
Hmm.
makes things happen. Almost. I think that's not quite how it works. But she says, "Let it be," right? And it's this openness to grace and to suffering that will come with it. Um, So sorry, that was a digression.
No, but I think it's related. I'm thinking about the relationship. Just you mentioned you're not sure God makes things happen. And
Yeah,
I think the idea, like the phrase God is in control, has always kind of
yeah,
rubbed me the wrong way because I'm like, but the thing is, the only way God does things is through love. And
yeah,
love by its nature is
yes,
uncontrolling. And
yes,
so, like, there's some sort of contradiction, which does not, I don't think, get away from the idea that God is sovereign.
Right.
But I think
That's right.
that's the word I'm going to go back to
That's
rather than control.
that's
And
right.
yet there's such a human instinct to
Yes.
try to get things under control.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and yet there is this kind of surrender to love at its
Yes.
best when
Yes.
we are engaged with the mystery of it all rather than trying to control it through magic.
And think about how, I mean, I completely agree. I am completely on board with um the rejection of God is in control language. I understand why people say it, and I don't,
Yeah,
just like other language, I don't police it. If
right.
somebody says
Me
that,
too.
and yet it's the wrong category.
Mm,
Because God did not create the world. The cosmos that God created is not a machine control is a property of machines. And by the way, magic is the belief that the world is a secret machine, that if you learn the right spells or have the right
hmm.
substances, your potion or whatever, you can make the
Yeah,
machine
yeah.
do your thing. But the world God created is not a machine. It has an element of vulnerability built in. It has an element of unpredictability built in. This is true we now have, for past 100 years now, we have a scientific way of talking about this, which is the quantum layer of reality, which cannot be characterized in terms of mechanical properties. I mean, we talk about
Hmm.
quantum mechanics, but it's not mechanics like the way a machine works. Um, the world God made isn't like that. So God can't control the world he made because he didn't want a machine.
Right.
And he certainly doesn't want people to be machines. If we're going to index all of our understanding of God off the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus, there are all these indications in it that God, in order to fully intervene in the world, which is what the incarnation is, does not need to be in control, starting with being a baby. A baby
Mm,
isn't even in control of, in this case, his own bodily functions initially. And it needs years of depending on other people. But then, even as an adult, Jesus, so first of all, he's constrained by, he doesn't have a magician's ability to just come and go before the resurrection. Now, interestingly, it's not like it's out of the question. Philip, the disciple or apostle, whatever we want to call him, in Acts actually is translocated from one place to another as an ordinary
mm,
human being. Like, he meets the Ethiopian eunuch out in the desert, and then suddenly he's
right.
gone and he's somewhere else. So it's not like God can't move things around in that way if God chooses. But in Jesus, he doesn't. The 33-year-old Jesus, when he goes to the cross, has always just been in one place. He hasn't just sort of apparated
Right.
back and forth.
Bopped around. Yeah.
Um, there's one time when he's transfigured for a brief moment, and the disciples kind of see, oh, anything's possible for this person.
Hmm.
But to be in the redemptive role he has come to play, he doesn't access any magic. And even the miracles, there's this weird thing in Mark in particular that says he couldn't do miracles there because they didn't believe. He's embedded deeply enough in this relational context where people's
Yeah.
willingness to trust him somehow affects what he can do. And if that's God's ultimate intervention, I think that suggests that even if God could be in control, God is not interested in being in control
Right.
because it will ruin what makes the world the life-giving reality that it is. And it will ruin relationships because you can't, love and control, as you said, are just, they're opposites almost. So yeah, we have
Yeah.
to,
Well, and
yeah.
no, I'm feeling like I want to, I feel like if I could just pause and think for like 20 minutes, I'd come back and I'd ask some question that pulls all the threads together of this conversation. It's so close in my mind. I'm not sure I'm going to get there, but what I'm thinking about in trying is actually bringing it back to the idea of culture making, which I think
Mm,
you just did in some ways, like that God is not simply making the world or humans into a machine, but actually entrusting the world, like actually saying, you are
yes,
made in my image, and
yes,
I am among you, I condescend and suffer with
yes,
you, live with
yes.
you, and
Wow.
also invite you to participate in this work of love, not of control, that I am like continuing to bring into this creation. And so I'm thinking about Yeah, I guess I want to end by talking a little bit about our role in it all, whether
Mm,
that is kind of, playing the violin in the rubble or
mm,
saying I'm sorry
mm,
or perhaps something more even constructive, like making things. I'm also thinking about the idea, this podcast is called Reimagining the Good Life. You mentioned the
mm.
Imagineers. There's also a place for the imagination, for
Yeah,
actually, but it's
yeah.
interesting because that word magic is kind of in there, right? Like the imagination
Mm,
is different than magic, but they're related.
yeah.
Like how do we use our imaginations in a way that opens us up to the mystery of life, that brings love into the world, and that does not insist on a magical future? That I'm gonna end it with that question for you.
Well, I don't think that's a question. I think that's a commission. That is what we are to do, and we each have to figure out how to do it. For you and me, to the extent that part of our work is using words,
Yeah.
it's to go on using words carefully when everyone around you is using them like bombs, um, and and to feel like it's not enough will be part of the vocation. At least I feel this
Mm,
way. I feel this
yeah.
very acutely right now.
Yes.
I think probably the biggest thing that's changed between 2008 when I published Culture Making and today is I'm I'm still hopeful. I think by the grace of God I've retained hopefulness through my whole life, but almost 20 years later, I'm a lot less optimistic. and and I see a lot less room for multiple reasons. We could have a whole other podcast about this, but I see the space in which one can create worthwhile things as greatly diminished in our
Hmm.
world in certain ways, and the hope that we can have that they'll last or that they'll be noticed or that they'll matter. All of those, I am less
Hmm.
positive than I was
Yeah.
2 decades ago, but it's still what we have to do. And it's every month I make a very long drive because my mom lives very near my sister, but not near us. And
Mm.
it's good that she's near my sister, but she needs both kids to be in her life. And so every month I drive and a long way, and I sit in her small room with a life that once was so expansive but now is pretty small because of her limitations at this stage of life, and just try to be with her.
Yeah.
And it produces nothing. I'm not in control of anything that matters most. And it's probably the most important thing I do in most months is to be there. And I think uh, in every dimension of our lives, we have to figure out like what's the thing that is just pure care,
Hmm.
and how do I do that? And that isn't just it is the people, but it's also your work. It's the what maybe no one will notice that you care, but you care. And so you do that thing well and faithfully,
Yeah.
even if it's not like on in your incentive structure, your bonus cap table, or whatever. Um, we keep doing those things, because to do those things that way, uh, kind of requires, maybe is the best word, requires you to pray
Mm.
and teaches you to pray, and and thus it kind of invites you into relationship with God, which is really what all of it is meant to do in the long run.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for all these thoughts. I hope that listeners will take from this what, to me, the kind of simplest version of all that we've just said is to actually show up with care,
Mm,
um,
mm,
with kindness and paying attention. But there's
mm,
so much, I think, that can be derived from that, and where each of us can think about what that means in our everyday lives. And it's going to be different, whether it's attending, like paying attention with kindness to an elderly parent, or in my case, more likely a teenage child,
mm.
or a neighbor, or even
Yeah,
ourselves, to actually,
yeah,
be willing to take care and pay attention to ourselves as beings who have limits and needs, and yet also great capacities to participate in that relationship of love and the work of love in the world. So Thank you for going in all these different directions with me today and for being here.
Thank you so much, Amy Julia.